So today we're going to be speaking about the truce from July 1921 until the outbreak of civil war, which is at the very end of June 1922. Now, why would you want to talk about the truce? Isn't this the time when nothing happened? It's not. The truce is really important for a lot of different reasons. Number one, the truce is the beginning of the transfer of power from British to Irish authorities in the 26 counties in what became the Irish Free State. Number two, the truce is the time when the Republican movement split into two antagonistic parts, which were to fight the Civil War. And number three, the truce is a time which can be described as a power vacuum. Now, this term is used all the time, but there was an actual power vacuum in Ireland in late 1921, but especially after 1922, after the signing of the treaty, when there was no effective law of any kind. The British were beginning to pack up and leave. The Irish authorities were being set up, and this exposed all kinds of conflicts, which Pádraig will talk about, which rose to the surface at the time of the truce. Okay, so without going on further, Pádraig will elaborate further. I want to say a few words about Pádraig. Our speaker tonight is Pádraig O'Rourke. Pádraig hails from County Clare. He has written 3 books so far about the revolutionary period in Ireland. The first book is about his home county, Blood on the Banner, about the War of Independence in County Clare. Second book about the battle for Limerick City at the start of the Civil War. It's called The Battle for Limerick, 1922. And the third book, Revolution, which is a pictorial history of the Irish Revolution. You can pick up a copy afterwards if you're interested. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Pádraig O'Rourke.
Thanks very much. Yeah, do please pick up a copy because they're very heavy, they're hardback, and I've been carrying around 10 copies all day. My back is nearly broken. First of all, thanks very much to John and to the People's College for inviting me to speak here. Obviously, this is a very important time we're living in terms of history, and we've the decade of centenaries. I like to call it the decade of centenaries because not everything that happened during that period is necessarily worth commemorating. The decade of centenaries is going to be useless if all we do is polish up old statues and gravestones and wave flags and lay wreaths. What we really need is a decade of learning. We want to emerge from that decade knowing more about this period than when we came into it. And part of that involves talking about stuff that's unpleasant, having it out, challenging old propaganda, challenging new propaganda. My job here this evening really is to bridge the gap between the lectures that Kieran Brennan and John Morgan-Lovo have given you on the War of Independence and the one that John Dorney is preparing on the Civil War. I'm going to start off by talking about the end of the War of Independence period into the truce period and the run-up to the Civil War. Now, mainly I'll be focusing in the talk on the military aspects, while I'm perfectly happy to take questions on the political aspects and try and answer as much of it as I can for you. The War of Independence, often referred colloquially as the Tan War, and this is a bit of a misnomer. We talk about the IRA fighting the Black and Tans, and we tend to forget that the British forces, the old RIC with a lot of Irishmen in it, the auxiliaries were all there as well. And quite often those forces actually did the crimes and the killings and the reprisals that the Black and Tans get blamed for. Because we like to have a neat little version of history. We like to have the War of Independence as all Catholic Irishmen on one side and Protestant Englishmen on the other. And if you look at something, let's say, like the shooting of Thomas McCurtain in Cork, which happened around this time in March of 1920, it's often said, oh, Thomas McCurtain killed by the Black and Tans in Cork. Thomas McCurtain was killed by Irishmen in the RIC at a time when there wasn't a single Black and Tan in Cork. So the War of Independence, in many ways, is a civil war. Not so much between tribes, but between ideologies, between those Irish who saw themselves as loyalists and those who followed the Republican, or some would say nationalist ideology. This photograph here, I like to start with. It's interesting because these are not the Black and Tans, these are the auxiliaries. What do you notice about the auxiliary seated in the lorry, second from the right? 14, 15 years of age. Remember, 750,000 boys under the age of 16 fought in the British Army in the First World War. He presumably is one of them, or else he lied about his wartime career. The other thing we tend to forget as well is that a lot, or well, not a lot, but a significant minority of those in the British forces at the time, in the Black and Tans, in the auxiliaries, are actually Irishmen. Photograph the auxiliaries again. I think this is Grafton Street. There was a great article in History Ireland magazine, I think about 2008, 2009, called Who Were the Black and Tans, and that gives the statistics. But I think about 19% of the auxiliaries and about 10% of the 90% of the black and tans and about 10% of the Aussies were actually Irish born, and we tend to forget that. One thing I think which really gets the War of Independence very intense is the treatment of prisoners, particularly by the British. Tom Barry said about the War of Independence, the British went out to destroy us and our civilization. They went down into the mire to destroy us and our civilization, and down after them we had to go. This is part of it. The treatment of prisoners is so bad during the war that this actually results in a lot of the, I'm looking for the right word here, bitter or very reprisal killings basically on the Republican side. This is Tom Hales and Pat Hart, two leaders of the IRA's West Cork Brigade, captured outside Bandon in April of 1920. Hales and Hart were captured while hiding explosives at an IRA arms dump by the Essex Regiment. They were stripped naked, tied onto those explosives, threatened with being blown up. They were redressed, taken back to barracks. They were caned, pistol whipped, thrown down the stairs, put in front of a firing squad twice and threatened with execution, photographed, and then finally had their fingertips crushed with pliers. One of these men, Tom Hales, who you see there on the left, survived his treatment. The other, Pat Hart, who you see on the right, did not. He went insane, spent the rest of his short life in a lunatic asylum. You've all seen the film Windle Chase the Barry? That scene by Ken Loach is based on what happened to these men, but the one thing Ken Loach got wrong, the guy who was leading the torture was Irish. Captain Cameron Joseph O'Connor Kelly. Catholic, born in Sligo, raised I think around Kilrush in County Clare, so I could call him my fellow countyman as well. And again, I think these are the things we need to think about the War of Independence. It is more complex when you get guys like Kelly involved. These two guys are Patrick and Harry Loughnane, two members of the IRA from Shanaglash in Galway, at the Clare-Galway border. They were captured by the auxiliaries in November of 1920 and disappeared. We've had great controversies about disappearance recently. Let's not forget the British disappeared people as well. But certain sections of the media and historical profession are only interested in dirty stuff that was done by the IRA. They disappeared from British custody. The British said, oh, they escaped. We don't know where they're gone. A week later, their bodies were found. A warning, this is pretty gruesome. Those are the bodies of Patrick and Harry Loughnane before burial. You'll notice that Patrick, most of his face and his head is missing. These men were allegedly dragged along behind lorries to their deaths. I think the cause of death was laceration of the skull and brain. They had wounds, their bodies had been defaced, they had wounds carved into their chest. One of them, I think his arm had almost come off, they were missing fingers. Really gruesome stuff. This is Peadar Clancy, Clareman, Vice Brigadier, second in charge of the Dublin Brigade during the War of Independence under Dick McKee. McKee, Clancy, and a civilian, Conor Clune, often described as an IRA man, but in fact a civilian, were captured the night before Bloody Sunday and killed that night, I think, after the Croke Park shootings, pretty much in revenge. Now, the official British story is that they had tried to escape. The British really tried to get this explanation across and produced a photograph, an alleged photograph of the escape attempt. The story was that while being held in Dublin Castle, shown here, the three men had gotten hold of a shovel, had beaten their guard unconscious, found a box of hand grenades that had been left around unguarded, fought their way out, and in the course of the fight were killed. That's highly spurious to say the least. The reality is they were probably killed in reprisal. So why does this treatment of prisoners matter so much? Well, at least 42 by my count, and some figures put it as high as 127, at least 42 prisoners, both IRA and civilian, while unarmed, in full British custody, were killed while allegedly trying to escape. On top of this, the British begin executing captured IRA volunteers. I think they start with Kevin Barry in November of 1920. And the IRA's argument, of course, is we're an army. You can't execute prisoners. That is against the rules of war. The British argument is you're not an army. You're criminals, you're bandits, you're a murder gang. We don't have to treat you that way. We will stamp out banditry and criminality with execution if necessary. What this leads to is the IRA taking revenge and shooting unarmed and off-duty British soldiers. At the beginning of the War of Independence, the IRA quite often captured British soldiers in ambushes, took their arms, took their weaponry and said, right, off you go, we can't take you prisoner, go home. But when the killing, shot trying to escape of prisoners begins, the IRA basically take the gloves off and say, well, if you're not going to play by the rules of war, we're not going to either. This is Private William Gill, 20 years old, from the Hampshire Regiment. In February of 1921, the British Army executed 6 Republican prisoners in Cork. That evening, the IRA in Cork City go out and basically start shooting and killing British soldiers who were off duty walking the streets of Cork. The British executed 6 volunteers that morning by chance. The IRA killed 6 British soldiers that evening. They wounded a number of others. So we talk about the Hague Convention and the rules of war which were there at the time. I would argue the British complained that the Republicans didn't obey the rules of war. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't wear insignia, they didn't appear in the open, they were a guerrilla army, they weren't entitled to treatment as prisoners of war. Well, I would argue that the British didn't obey the rules of war either, and here's the proof. This photograph is from a British archive. It allegedly shows Sinn Féin prisoners being loaded onto a lorry. Now, they have to be very nice prison guards to be sharing their cigarettes, as we see here with the men in civilian clothing if they're prisoners. They have to be really nice to hand them rifles and bandoliers. What you're actually seeing here is British troops in an undercover operation wearing civilian clothes, disguised as IRA, doing the exact same thing they had complained about the IRA doing. My argument is the Hague Convention, the laws of war, weren't obeyed by either side during the War of Independence. It was the conditions of war. Side A has stooped to this law, we're going to do it. Side B has taken that advantage, we're going to do the same. One thing that's been controversial as well is the shooting and the disappearance, the killing and burying bogs of British Army deserters. Now, desertion very common in the First World War. Soldiers, usually from poor working class backgrounds, fed up with their treatment in the British Army, say, right, I'm out of here, I've had enough of this, and run off, try and get home. This is a genuine phenomenon during the War of Independence. British soldiers are getting fed up and leaving. A number of them will sell their guns to the IRA en route to make the money to get home. Some of them, like Reginald Hathaway in Kerry, Peter Monaghan in Cork, are British soldiers who actually defect and join the IRA and died fighting on the Republican side. English Protestants being killed fighting for Irish freedom. It's not how we imagine the War of Independence. The British decide to try and capitalise on this phenomenon by sending out fake deserters. Guys roaming the countryside, pretending to be deserters, gather what information they can about the IRA, escape, bring the information back to us. We know the British did this, we don't know to what extent they did it, and it's hard to pick out in these cases whether these guys are genuine deserters, whether they're spies. This is the body of Private Fielding, killed outside of Mallow in North Cork in April of 1920. One case in Charleville is quite famous. The British, when these guys get shot, need to explain why they were absent. Usually they say they were deserters. 2 unidentified British soldiers in Cork, British claim that these guys, the Nelly the Elephant excuse, as I call it, had run away to join a travelling circus, which seems a bit ridiculous to me. If you were in the British Army in Kabul at the moment and you saw a travelling circus go by, would you think that's my ticket home? I don't think so. If anyone thinks that this treatment of British soldiers and British deserters by the IRA is particularly harsh, well, it's the exact same thing the British would be doing in the First World War. They find people wandering around their lines who they can't identify, and they shoot them, and they dump them at the side of the road. Like you see in this illustration from the War Illustrated, the British propaganda magazine during the First World War. Short shrift for spies at the battlefront. So you get a guy, you think he's a spy, shoot him, dump his body at the side of the road, and look what's pinned to their clothing. Labels reading the word spy. This is exactly the kind of thing the IRA do in the War of Independence that the British complain about. But where did guys like Tom Barry learn their soldier? They learned it in the British Army. These guys were sitting at home following British propaganda magazines during the war, seeing these images. The way the two sides conduct themselves is often very similar. This is a genuine spy label from the British Archives in Kew in London. It was pinned to the body of Alexander Pearson, killed just before the truce in Mallow in Cork. Pearson was a Protestant ex-soldier, and the shooting of spies is one of the most controversial aspects of the War of Independence at the moment. And certain academics say, oh, the IRA were out to get ex-soldiers and were out to get Protestants, and that they used the intelligence war as an excuse to shoot them. Professor David Fitzpatrick of Trinity College in the Two Irelands talked about this, and he said, though many of the dead had indeed tipped off the police or the castle, others were the victims of numerous or paranoid assumptions. Adulterers, homosexuals, tinkers, beggars, ex-servicemen, Protestants. The purity of the fight had been sullied, even in the Republican consciousness, well before the truce. Now I take issue with this. Firstly, how would anyone at the time have known who was homosexual? Remember, homosexuality was illegal at that time. Where has Fitzpatrick got his data on this? Ex-servicemen, Protestants, well, this is the thing that has been said. Jane Leonard has talked about the IRA. We'll take ex-soldiers first and examine this. Jane Leonard has talked about ex-soldiers being hated and despised by the British Army. She said that ex-soldiers weakened the revolution's effectiveness by refusing to join Sinn Féin, subscribe to its funds, or obey the rulings of the courts. Can anyone identify that British soldier for me?
Tom Barry.
Tom Barry, okay. Tom Barry, one of the most famous and successful IRA leaders of the war. Not the only British soldier. Emmett Dalton, Director of Training for the IRA, ex-British soldier. Ignatius O'Neill, leader of the Mid-Clare Brigade's flying column, ex-British soldier. Dan McSweeney, training officer in Cork, ex-British soldier. William Corrie, who was an ex-British soldier enlisted in the IRA as Dublin Brigades during the war, said, quote, during my service with the IRA, I met hundreds of ex-servicemen. Were the IRA prejudiced against ex-servicemen? No, I don't think so. Why would they have accepted so many into their ranks otherwise? Remember even James Connolly in 1916, ex-British Army. Okay, so this is the most controversial one. The IRA were they using the intelligence war as a pretext for sectarian killings of Protestants. Fitzpatrick has claimed it, Peter Hart claimed it in his work, Kevin Myers and Owen Harris like to refer to it in theirs. There's numerous other academics and people. I'm doing a PhD at the moment. I have collated exact data and figures on the War of Independence. My figures, I'm not going to give you the exact number because I haven't published this yet, but it's between 180 and 190 civilians were killed as spies during the War of Independence. Of those whose religion is known, and there's 5 or 6 whose religion I can't work out or whose religion was never established, because their identity was never established, according to my figures, 24.58% of those civilians killed as spies during the War of Independence were Protestants. By that I'm talking Church of Ireland, Methodist, Presbyterian. Can anyone guess for me the percentage of Protestants in Ireland at that time? 24.7%. So the IRA, I would say, were equal opportunity executioners. Yes, they did kill a lot of Protestants as suspected spies, but they killed far, far more, 3 times more Catholics as suspected spies. And that isn't emphasised. When you look at where spies were shot in the intelligence war, it's completely different in different parts of Ireland. I think there's maybe 12 counties, not this off the top of my head, where no spies are shot. And on top of that, you have another 7 counties where no Protestants are shot as spies. If you add that up, 19 of Ireland's 32 counties, not a single Protestant shot as a spy in the War of Independence. But when we get certain sections of the media and academia talking about the War of Independence, we only want to discuss one thing, the alleged sectarianism of the IRA throughout Ireland. What they're really talking about is Cork. In Cork, 30.34% of those killed by the IRA, such as George O'Connor here, as spies, were Protestants. Again, that's according to my figures. Slightly high than the national average, but remember, places like Bandon in West Cork was known as the Little Derry of the South. There was a huge Protestant population there at the time. So all this stuff that's been said about sectarianism and the intelligence war and shooting the spies, I think people have been too quick to jump to conclusions. As I said, I'll hopefully be producing this data when I've finished my studies. Let's just take a quick look at some of those counties and the intelligence work. County Armagh, you can imagine right up there in the north, a lot of sectarianism, 2 spies shot, both Catholics. County Clare, 3 shot, all Catholics. Galway, 3, all Catholic. Laois, 2, 1 Catholic, 1 Protestant. And again, you can see here their full name, you can see the date they were killed, their religion, and whether they had previously been in the British Army or the RIC or not. So I'm not using anonymous people here to collate figures. These are actual people killed. Dublin, I think it's 13 killed. We look at the first one there, William Jack Straw. I think he's shot out by Balbriggan. His religion unknown. His exact identity was never established. So he's one of the 5 or 6 whose identity I can't, religion we don't know. But of the 13, there are 1, 2, 3, 4 Protestants killed, 1 unknown, and the rest Catholic. So we've talked a bit about the War of Independence there. We're going to talk about the end of it now and how the truce came about. Basically, it's not just military. There was a huge amount of political pressure on the British at the time. The British had passed the Government of Ireland Act. There was elections for that coming up in May of 1921. That was going to establish 2 parliaments. One in the 6 most northeastern counties, today known as the North in Northern Ireland, and one Southern Ireland for Southern Ireland. When the election happens, it's completely polarised. In the South in particular, all the seats, except for the 4 for Trinity College, are all won by Sinn Féin. Now this creates a crisis for the British. They predicted this was probably going to happen anyway. But they need constitutionally the Southern Parliament to meet. It has to meet by the 14th of July under the terms of the Act. If the Parliament does not meet by that date, the British have to declare Crown Conwy government. What does that mean? Essentially it means martial law. That would be a huge embarrassment for the British. So the British have 2 options here. They can keep trying to find a political solution to this, or they can go down the road of imposing a military and political solution. So this is Crown Conwy government and martial law. General Neville Macready, who's commander of the British forces in Ireland, said he would need 100,000 extra British troops to put down a rebellion in Ireland. Now where are they going to get them? Britain was fighting in the Russian Civil War on the side of the White Russians. I think they were putting down rebellions in Egypt. They were in Iraq at the time. They were basically overstretched. This would be a real draw on resources to try and get that many troops. Macready also said they would need to shoot up to 100 Republicans a week, often without court-martial. We find a guy using arms, we just shoot him there on the spot. It's pretty much what they were doing anyway, but making it public would obviously not have been very popular. The other thing is that the British public fed up with the war. It was costing £20 million a year. There was huge pressure on the British from the Empire, Canada, Australia, big Irish communities complaining about what was going on. Britain's wartime ally, America, is fed up with it as well, and a huge Irish lobby there. So between May of 1921 and the truce in July of 1921, the British try and have one last push. I should say as well, before I move on to that a truce had actually been possible in November, December of 1920. Negotiations were underway. They were churning away in the background all the way through. By December of 1920, Michael Collins was on the run. Griffith, who I think was in prison. De Valera was in America. He's not really involved in this, but had actually pretty much agreed terms for the truce with the British. The problem was there was huge confusion as to who the British were actually dealing with. And you had people sticking their oar in when it wasn't wanted. Roger Sweetman, Sinn Féin TD for Wexford, isn't happy with ambushes, regards them as immoral, and just jumps up and says, I want to negotiate a truce with the British. Patrick Moylet, who's a Republican businessman from Galway, the Galway Mayo area, says, I'm going to secure a truce. Father Flanagan, who's vice president of Sinn Féin, again needs his own truce initiative. And when the British see all these different ones springing up, they go, hang on, there's something happening here. The IRA are desperate. Should we have a truce at all? And then when a truce is almost agreed, in December 1920, the British military authorities step in and say, do not sign that. Give us 2 months. 2 months, we guarantee you we'll wipe out the IRA. They're on the run. We have them on the ropes. And that was a missed opportunity. So the British, 6 months later, are still trying to finish off their 2-month job. There was one last big military push. The British thought about bringing in extra troops. and using new tactics. One thing they developed, the Essex Regiment in West Cork, developed their own flying columns. Let's get off the road blocked by the IRA. Let's get out of our vehicles, take to the hills, chase the IRA. It's a good initiative, but it doesn't produce huge results. The other thing the British do is they organise sweeps and roundups. Get every available British troop, pick an area where we know there's been an ambush, surround it, surround the water side with British destroyers, fly aeroplanes overhead, and we'll walk through and we'll catch the IRA, we'll tighten the noose around them. And it doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is because the IRA obviously hide their guns, they're arrested with a load of civilians. The Irishmen in the RIC have either quit or are too scared to identify who's who. The British don't know who they're dealing with. And you have what you see here in the photograph. Dozens of young men lined up, British officers going up and down questioning them, quite often in areas where you've only got monoglot Irish speakers who haven't a word of English. And their options are either let them all go or take them all prisoner. So the sweeps don't really seem to work either. And then the British adopt larger patrols with like an armoured carriage you can see here. Makes it very difficult for the IRA, but not impossible to ambush and attack them. And the IRA is trying to make engineering leaps, making their own hand grenades, making their own landmines, seeing what they can do to disrupt bigger patrols like this. So does any of this actually work? Not really, is my argument. The British job in Ireland was the restoration of order. And you see here the figures for RIC, DMP killed, British Army killed, and total reported outrages to the RIC. January 1919, beginning of the War of Independence, 2 RIC men killed at Soahead Beck, 0 British soldiers killed. Total reported outrages, 198, just under 200. Let's go down to November of 1920. At the time of Bloody Sunday, Kilmichael ambush. Number of RIC and DMP killed, 37. Number of British soldiers killed, 23. Number of outrages, 1,335. Now after that, the British introduced martial law in Munster. They introduced the execution of prisoners. They introduced all sorts of new stuff. And you come down to June of 1921, 41 police killed, 20 British soldiers killed, 2,256 reported outrages. Despite everything the British tried, they're not being able to put the lid on this. That doesn't necessarily mean, however, the IRA are winning. Let's be clear about this. The IRA were never, as a guerrilla army, in a position to drive the British into the sea like St. Patrick with the snakes. That was not going to happen. But the longer the struggle continued, the better their bargaining position came. Even if the IRA had completely broken the will of British forces in the south, there was a huge problem in the north with the Loyalists. The Loyalists had been organised into the Special Constabulary, the Brigade Specials. People with local knowledge, who knew the area, who knew the people, who were well armed, not well disciplined, but well armed. They were a very effective force fighting the IRA in the north. And even in the scenario, if the IRA completely defeated the British in the south, they would have had a huge problem in the north. Anyway, let's not go into that counterfactual history. Let's talk about the IRA's actual position. Burning of the Customs House, major event, big propaganda victory for the IRA, daylight raiding attempt in the middle of Dublin City. But the IRA were already in Dublin very low on ammunition. The burning of the Customs House cost them heavily. 5 IRA volunteers killed, another 80 or more taken prisoner, including many members of Michael Collins' famous squad. Dozens of revolvers and pistols captured. You can see here British officers actually investigating or having a look at IRA weaponry which had been captured, not just in that, but in other raids. The IRA in Dublin were desperately short of ammunition and manpower. Here the whole time the IRA only had enough ammunition for 2 weeks left in Dublin. The problem in Dublin was you attacked a lorry of British soldiers. You didn't have time to go to fight the ambush to a finish and go up and get them to surrender and take their rifles and ammunition. You could do that in Cork. You could do that in Clare or Laois or wherever. You couldn't do it in the streets of Dublin City. The remains of the squad and the Dublin Brigade Active Service Unit were amalgamated into the Guard. They tried to make basically a stopgap military unit. This later became the Dublin Guard, famous, or should I say infamous, for events in Kerry. But just to show you how bad things were, Daniel MacDonald, who was an intelligence officer with A Company, 1st Battalion, Dublin Brigade, talked about IRA units in Dublin stealing from each other to try and get ammunition. Talked about, if you know anything about ballistics, IRA volunteers getting 303 rifle ammunition and sawing it in half to try and put it into revolvers. This is crazy stuff. They're desperate. And Daniel MacDonald says, things were so bad with all the units that it was a question of how long could they last. Would we last a month? Would we last a fortnight? The only reason was we had little left to fight with. We had no ammunition, we had a few guns. Now that's the situation in Dublin. It's bleak, and Richard Mulcahy, Chief of Staff in the IRA, put a lot of store on what was happening in Dublin. But look down the country. This is the West Mayo flying column photographed a few days before the truce. Every one of them has a Lee Enfield rifle. That was well armed as British soldiers. And Vice Commandant Patrick Joseph Cannon, who's photographed here, I think he's in the back row, says, the troops found us in good form. Our morale was high. We had about 100 rounds per rifle. In fact, we had more arms and ammunition than we had men for. We put more men under arms by redistributing the ammunition. Basically, they're in a good position to keep fighting. So it's very patchy. The IRA in the Midlands being inactive, we don't think of Meath and Laois and Offaly as being particularly active, but they were starting to get active at the time, and that was a problem for the British. Really, what it boils down to, I'll take a quote from each side. Sean Clifford, Mid-Limerick Brigade. Limerick, by the way, does not get enough credit for the Republican struggle there. It was very strong. He analysed it perfectly. He said England could have beaten the IRA in perhaps a week or so if she had waged war as was usual at the time. That is, by the use of artillery, tanks, gas, aeroplanes. England, however, could not do these things because she had told the world she was rescuing the Irish people from a murder camp. There was no solid reason why the IRA couldn't hold out indefinitely, provided England continued on with her contemptible black and tans. They couldn't go in. They couldn't level whole towns and villages and shoot 100 people a week. It would have caused outrage internationally. British public opinion wouldn't have taken it either. And the other thing we find in Civil War divisions later is that usually the Free State guys argue, oh, we were finished, we couldn't continue. And the Republicans say the treaty was a sellout, we should have fought to the end. Sean Clifford went Free State, and he's arguing we could have held out, but the thing was going nowhere. Montgomery, intelligence officer in Cork during the War of Independence, later British hero of World War II, his own comment on it in 1924. To win a war of this sort, you need to be ruthless. Oliver Cromwell or the Germans would have settled it in a very short time. Nowadays, public opinion precludes such methods. The nation would never allow it, and the politicians would have lost their job if they had sanctioned it. We could probably have squashed the rebellion as a temporary measure, but it would have broken out again like an ulcer the moment we removed the troops. The only way, therefore, was to give them some form of self-government. The opening of the Northern Parliament in June of 1921, the British King makes a speech that's conciliatory between all these peace negotiations involving the African Prime Minister Jan Smuts and Lloyd George and De Valera, and eventually De Valera sends a letter asking for peace, De Valera is sent a letter by Lloyd George asking for peace negotiations to begin. The actual truce is signed on the 8th of July 1921 here in Dublin at the Mansion House. This is General Neville Macready, Commander of British Forces in Ireland, on his way into that meeting with Dublin's Lord Mayor. What do you notice about his uniform pocket? He has a gun in it, you can see the outline. This was picked up by the press. He got in a lot of trouble for it, and he said, I learned many things in my time in the Emerald Isle, but trusting the Irish wasn't one of them. The truce is agreed on Friday, it comes into operation on a Monday. Why was there that gap of 3 or 4 days? Basically, they needed time to get the word out. For example, British units down in Cork getting the message by carrier pigeon, because all their phone lines had been cut and there was a delay. They needed time to let everyone know this was happening. Exact same thing happened in the First World War. The 11th day, the 11th hour, the 11th month. Yeah, but the ceasefire had been agreed 6 hours beforehand, and that was with much better communications in a different type of war. Some units didn't hear about it when we're talking about Africa for weeks later. First World War continued in Africa for 2 weeks after that. And other places, yeah. in that time, there's been a lot written, and this is actually what I'm doing with my PhD on the IRA launched one last push and tried to kill as many people as possible and had all these sectarian killings of Protestants and all this stuff. And a lot of it's propaganda. Certainly, some very grisly things were done. This is the shooting of 4 unarmed, off-duty British soldiers in Cork the night before the truce. Absolutely a war crime. You cannot take unarmed soldiers and shoot them. But this is the kind of thing that had been happening all through the War of Independence by both sides. There were reasons for this, and I would link this back to the shooting of, again, Republican prisoners captured by the British. There's other instances and stuff that's been written about the truce, like Constable Alfred Needham shot in Ennis. He'd just gotten married that morning. He was walking out of the church with his new bride, the IRA being tipped off. They ran up, stuck a gun in his back, and blew him away. And they knew the truce was coming. Great story, make a great Hollywood movie. Absolute fiction. Constable Alfred Needham was killed, but he was killed by an IRA unit that did not yet know the truce had been agreed in Dublin. There was no marriage. He was a single man. Someone cooked that up as propaganda. But the last people killed in the war, there's always going to be this story that, oh, those killings were unnecessary and more lives could have been saved. The other thing which people are talking about, the truce and the killings in the immediate days before it don't talk about, is the number of people killed by the British. For some reason, there's this really big focus on those killed by Republicans, and then there's no mention of those killed, because the British went on killing people in the final days and hours as well. This is Dennis Spriggs, unarmed IRA volunteer, captured in his home by the British military in Cork, said, hands up, you got me, put him onto a lorry, he was shot trying to escape, he tried to run away from us. This is a photograph outside Dublin Castle when the truce actually does come into effect, and basically, things do grind to a halt very quickly. Now, there's a number of killings and incidents during the truce I'm going to talk about now in a minute, but basically that puts a cap to the War of Independence. I'm going to talk about some very controversial things in a few minutes, like the Dunmanway killings and all that sort of stuff. And I'm saying at the start, if you're looking at the truce, even if someone was an informer, even if someone had done something really dirty during the War of Independence, there's a ceasefire. You're not supposed to kill people during a ceasefire. The IRA basically have no idea how long the truce is going to last, neither do the British. The IRA use it as a training opportunity. Here we see an IRA unit in the Midlands, and look at them again, they're not in uniform, but they have proper military rifles, they have proper discipline, they're in the open, they're forming into an army. The treaty debates and the politics around this, look, I don't need to go through which everyone here knows it, yeah? Pretty much you all know the politics of the time. The treaty is signed in December of 1921. It splits Sinn Féin, it splits all the Republican organisations. Basically, North of Ireland going to stay within the Union, local government there, but it's Unionist dominated, that's copper fastened. South of Ireland really is what the Civil War is about. It largely gets independence. They didn't know it leads to the independence we have now, but realistically it's getting independence as a British Dominion. It gets its own government, its own army, its own flag, its own police force. But here's the crucial thing, still inside the British Empire. British king, head of state, and you would have to swear an oath of loyalty to the British king. That was a huge stumbling block for anyone who was a doctrinaire Republican. Flora Beckley said about the War of Independence, he said, a lot of the guys fighting it, Republic was just a word for independence. They didn't understand Republican politics quite often, they didn't know what it meant. It was really that the War of Independence was kind of, for some of the guys fighting it, some of them were die-hard doctrinaire Republicans, but for some of them, and with all these different strands, it was just, let's get the British out. We'll worry about what happens after this, let's just get them out. And the War of Independence really, or sorry, the Civil War, key issue was not the North. Go back and look at the treaty debates. Only a few people like Sean Moylan actually mentioned the North. It's the oath and the empire. That's what they're talking about. We talk about the split that occurred in Sinn Féin and in the IRA. We divide it very neatly into two camps. Again, history is more complex than this. We say, oh, De Valera's supporters opposed the treaty, Michael Collins' supporters were in favour of it. And we forget about two of the other big leaders, Tom Griffith, Liam Lynch, Ernie O'Malley, these people in their thoughts that don't come into it at all. Realistically, you've got a number of different factions here. Let's take the pro-treaty side. Michael Collins is the military leader, Arthur Griffith is the political leader. Now I know Michael Collins assumes a lot of political powers, but Arthur Griffith, first man to sign the treaty over in London. Griffith, his 1905 Sinn Féin manifesto, dual monarchy. Griffith really didn't have a problem with the idea of a monarch in Ireland and links that way, and didn't have as much a problem with the empire. He kind of regarded the treaty as fait accompli. Michael Collins, Irish Republican Brotherhood, secret conspiracy. He was out fighting in 1916. He regards the treaty as a stepping stone. We're not there yet. We're going to use this as a springboard. This is not finished at all. What's Collins doing during the truce period? He's sending guns to the Northern Ireland. He's saying we're going to pull this thing apart over the British back. Griffith didn't know about this. Will he agree with it? Who knows? So that's the pro-treaty side, the number of different factions within it. Let's look at the anti-treaty side. De Valera. Oh, De Valera, and if he'd signed the treaty, and De Valera and stuff went on in the Civil War. By the time the fighting begins in the Civil War, as far as the Republicans are concerned, De Valera is nobody. Liam Lynch is the man in charge. During the fighting in Dublin, what's De Valera doing? Is he commanding a battalion? Is he in the Four Courts? He resumed his status as an ordinary volunteer. Liam Lynch is the guy that's in charge. The Civil War ends when Liam Lynch is killed. Liam Lynch famously said, we've gone out for a republic, we will live by no other law. He's one of these guys like Earl O'Malley, Liam Mellows, he's kind of a doctrinaire Republican. Full independence, republic, that's what we're out for. De Valera, document number 2. We can have external association with a republic inside the British Empire. It's a bit confusing, but basically, he's not on the same page as Lynch. So what I'm saying is, the lines are blurred here, even on the pro-treaty and the anti-treaty side, about politics. The IRA, obviously like all the other organisations, split. Discipline breaks down. There's a lot of drinking during the truce period. If you've just been part of the army that finally freed Ireland, you can answer the call, you don't have to put your hands in the pocket. And everyone wants to be. Tailors ran out of green material for making IRA uniforms because every young man wanted them, whether he was in the IRA or not. And both sides during the Civil War, you can see the graffiti here on Arnold Lowry from Dublin, we had no time for truces. Both sides accused the others of being trucideers. Where were you when the war was being fought? We were the men who did the real fighting, and we were for or against the treaty, whatever. This is a breakdown of the divisions during the War of Independence. Black and white map that pulled off the internet. The graphics are a bit unfortunate. It looks like Scotland has invaded and taken half the country. What you're talking about really is, I mean, even maps like this don't do it justice. Dublin City is split. You're walking from one block to another, and it's a bit like Ukraine at the moment. You have all these armed factions taking over barracks and taking over buildings and jostling for positions. That's what it was like when the IRA split. We'll take County Clare, for example. Clare on this map is identified as being pro-treaty. Its leader, Michael Brennan of the 1st Western Division, was pro-treaty. And East Clare was pro-treaty and Galway. Go to West Clare. Not at all. Anti-treaty, patches, changes from town to town. Personality is a huge thing here. 2 predominant Republican families in Clare, the Barretts and the Brennans, and they hated each other. From 1918 onwards, these guys were always rallying. And basically, when the wars of Civil War starts, 5 Republicans are executed by the Free State Army. All 5 Republicans are from Barrett's brigade area. And all 5 are executed in an area of military authorities run by the Brennans. They stopped that person. If you look at units, I think it's Middleton and Cork. Cork pretty much solidly Republican. And then the Middleton unit, to a man, goes Free State. There had to be some personality clash or something going on there. Skibbereen as well, just you get these little pockets. So the whole country is confused. You've essentially got 3 different authorities in it. You have the British government and forces in the north. The British are still in the south at this time, but are evacuating. And you have pro-treaty and anti-treaty. And all these guys have their own armies, they have their own police forces. The country is in chaos. The RIC are disbanded in, I think, February, March 1922. A large number of them head off to the north and join the RUC. There were 44 people killed, I think, during the truce period by the IRA. Quite a number of them ex-RIC men. But whether you got targeted during the truce or not depended a lot on the War of Independence activities. For example, this is a pass given by the 3rd Northern Division to an RIC man saying, this guy had been friendly to us, he passed information, don't touch it. So quite often, they didn't just want for any RIC men, quite often it was targeted. Again, to stress, the truce is on, these killings are not justified, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't some reason, they weren't completely random. This is a great article from the Irish Examiner about the Black and Tan protests in London. When they're demobilised, they all go back to Hyde Park. And, you know, huge unemployment in Britain. It's where a lot of the Black and Tans have come from. And when they go in looking for a job, what was your last employment? Oh, I was a Black and Tan in Ireland. No job for you. So they actually held a protest in Hyde Park to complain about their lack of employment, but the British public didn't exactly rally to them. A lot of them ended up enlisting in the Palestine Gendarmerie and were sent out to Palestine, Israel, whatever what you want to call it. Remember, the British were there at the time as well. So the British military starts withdrawing after the RIC goes. And what you have here is a photograph of the taking over of the barracks. Free State Army standing outside, waiting to take over, British marching out, and you'll see one of the British officers is saluting. You see the Free State Army have their arms at their rifles that present arms. That's a military salute. The two sides are giving kind of grudging respect to each other. But during the Civil War, it's important to remember, the British gave very important military assistance to the pro-treaty side. It was in their interest. They wanted to see the treaty upheld. This is the handing over of Beggars Bush Barracks in Dublin, first one handed over. That's Paddy O'Daly, I think, receiving the flag there from Richard Mulcahy, and Owen O'Duffy is behind him. The barracks in Dublin are formally handed over with great ceremonies and pageantry. Down the country, it's a free-for-all. The British are pulling out, and their orders are, give over your barracks to the IRA. Which branch of the IRA? Whoever is in the area, just pull up the stakes, get out. The British concentrate their forces in Dublin, and from there, retreat backwards. So again, like I said, Ukraine at the moment, different guys scrambling to take control of barracks and government buildings. By this time, the IRA and its pro and anti-treaty factions have, the lines are fairly obvious. The Free State government wants the pro-treaty troops in the Dublin Guard taking over the barracks to look pretty smart for propaganda reasons. So they get them all tailored into these green uniforms. From this stage onwards, I'm going to call them the Free State Army. I know some people prefer the term National Army, but just they're the army fighting for the Free State. That's what I'm using. Crisis break out over who's going to control these barracks. The Civil War begins at the end of June 1922. It almost begins in Limerick when the British withdraw. The areas Republican dominated, but Michael Brennan and the Free State Army are ordered in by Richard Mulcahy to take those barracks. They can't afford to lose Limerick. Guns are drawn, barricades are pulled across the streets. The Republican reinforcements from Cork, Tipperary and everywhere flood into Limerick. Ernie O'Malley has the castle in Limerick, King John's Castle, besieged. And he said to Rory O'Connor, give me explosives, I'll blow down the walls, I'll go in, I'll kill them all, we'll take back the place. And basically, Rory O'Connor refuses. There's posturing and crisis for a number of weeks in Limerick. The Free State are sending in troops and armoured cars like this one, but the fighting does not actually break out, it's avoided. The Free State Army will withdraw, the Republicans take the barracks. Belfast, truce isn't happening up there, not happening in the north. Roger McCordy, who was head of the IRA in Belfast at the time, I think famously said the truce. That thing lasted about 6 hours. Rioting, sectarianism, IRA attacks on the RIC, specials, revenge attacks on Republicans, that's continuing the whole time. The McMahon killings be a good example of this. 2 special constables killed in an IRA attack in Belfast city centre. Shortly after that, 2 Catholics are shot by unidentified gunmen, probably special constables or police. That night, men in police uniform using sledgehammers break their way into the home of Owen McMahon, who is a wealthy Catholic, no connection to the attacks, no connection to the IRA, no connection to the Sinn Féin. He's a home ruler through and through. There's 8 men in the house. They're all taken, put downstairs, they're told to say their prayers, and they're shot right there on the spot. 6 of the 8 are killed. Things happen down in the south, which people very quickly jump to and label sectarian. Particularly, again, I'm talking about media reports and badly researched history. This is a photograph of a Protestant-run orphanage for girls in Clifton in Galway. In June of 1922, just before the Civil War breaks out properly, Protestant-run orphanage for boys at Ballyconry is burned to the ground. Now, when you read about this, quite often it says the IRA burnt down a home for Protestant orphans. God, wasn't that terrible, naked sectarianism. Well, the orphanage was run by Mr. Charles Purkis, and he overheard a conversation with the local IRA leader that his daughter had. He reported this to the British, and here's what he says. Ballyconree Orphanage had been destroyed by the IRA because it had been used as a training school for boys to serve in the British Army. This is what the IRA are alleging. Further, the local IRA officer alleged that the IRA were in possession of evidence which proved that the Boy Scouts from the orphanage had been guilty of espionage and that the establishment at Ballyconree had been used for entertaining British forces during the war. All of which charges were more or less true. Again, burning children out of an orphanage, regardless of who's running it, is, not a thing to do. And is completely unjustifiable. But is it sectarian? That's the question. Let's not leap to conclusions. This brings us on then to something I'm sure you've all heard about, very controversial, the West Cork Massacre, April 1922. I cannot strongly enough recommend Barry Keane's book, the title of The West Cork Massacre, just published by Mercier Press, an excellent book which goes through this in detail. I'm just going to skim over the top of it. On the left here, Michael O'Neill, acting commanding officer, 1st Battalion, 3rd Cork Brigade, IRA, goes to the house pictured, Ballygroman House, owned by the Hornibrook families, Protestants living near Ovens in Cork. The IRA basically have gone there, they want their car, and they're taking them for a joyride or a trip. Apparently this is something they had done times before and had returned the car in one piece. The magneto had been taken out of the car. Couldn't start the car back then without it. Michael O'Neill climbed in the window you see there over the door into the house. I think they demanded entry and he refused. He climbed into the house and he was shot dead by Herbert Woods, an ex-soldier relative to the Hornibrooks living inside. Now, of course, the Hornibrooks didn't know who was outside. Remember, the country was in anarchy at the time and anyone could turn up claiming to be the IRA or anyone. What happened was O'Neill, as I said, was killed. Where were the local IRA leaders when O'Neill was killed? Well, O'Neill was the local IRA leader. He'd been put in charge because everyone else, like Sean Hales, you see photographed here, and all the other Cork leaders like Ian Lynch, were in Dublin trying to prevent the Civil War breaking out. So you don't have normal working conditions in Cork when this happens. Anyway, 3 men from that house, Herbert Woods, his uncle Samuel Hornibrook, and Thomas Hornibrook, are taken away, they're shot or killed by the IRA, we're not certain how, and disappeared. Bodies are never found. Over the following 2 nights, 10 other Protestant loyalists are killed in Cork. All of those killed were Protestant loyalists, but not all the loyalists attacked were Protestants. Some Catholics were attacked at that time as well, ex-RIC men in particular. Was there an intelligence link to these killings? Well, that's obviously very difficult to tell. The IRA, however, did have very good intelligence in that area. Flor Crowley, part of the Dunmanway workhouse where the auxiliaries were stationed, he shared a room with the local auxiliary intelligence officer who was in barracks. So anything that passed across his desk, notes were being taken by Flor Crowley, who was passing it to the IRA. Now, there's other people who've done a lot more research into this than me. I'm on the side again, Barry Keane, or Andrew Bielberg, Dr. Bielberg of UCC. Some intelligence links have been established between these guys and the British during the War of Independence, but not all of them. It would seem to be that this isn't necessarily targeting spies, it's targeting loyalists. Pretty straightforward, it's revenge for the killing of O'Neill. But again, to reiterate, the truce was on. Even if every single one of them had been a spy, there's a truce on. Their killing is not justifiable. Is it sectarian again? Make your own mind up. As I said, all those killed were Protestant, not all those attacked had their homes fired into were Protestant. Some Catholics were targeted as well. But I'm going to talk about something fairly controversial here. I know John Morganovo touched on it in his lecture to you. Sexual assault and rape during the War of Independence. Photograph of British patrol up in Monaghan during the War of Independence. In the middle are 2 women dressed in pretty much black and tan attire. These are women police searchers. Sexual assault during searches by British troops on Irish women was very common. To solve this problem, these were brought in, these women, often nurses from the First World War. Rape wasn't used as a weapon of war during the War of Independence, but rapes were committed. There's examples of a British soldier in Cork is caught in the act of raping a local woman in Cork City. There's another British soldier who's brought to trial for raping and killing a local woman, but he is not charged with it. And during the truce, there is a fairly horrific incident which happens in Tipperary, reported in the press at the time as the Tipperary outrage. Now, this occurred on the 12th of June 1922. Harriet Biggs, I think she was the wife of the local landlord, was raped by a number of men at her home in Hazel Point. 7 men were alleged to be involved, and I'm choosing my words carefully here. All were alleged to be members of the Drummoyne IRA company. 4 suspects were arrested. They were taken and brought before a Republican court. Now, obviously, remember that this is a completely different time. There's no DNA evidence. There's no CSI. Thomas Webb, who lived at the house, gave evidence to the court that he could not positively identify the accused, and they were released on bail. He did say, however, that they were wearing the IRA uniform. The Biggs fled to England, so there was no one there to give definite evidence linking the 4 suspects to the crime. The trial didn't proceed, and you don't want to blame them for running away to England. Another suspect who left Tipperary at this time and came to Dublin was Martin Hogan. He joined the IRA's Dublin Brigade, and he was abducted and killed by Free State forces in April of 1923. Kenmare incident, we're going into the Civil War here, but just I want to put all this in its context. Paddy O'Daly, former member of Michael Collins' squad, head of the Free State Army in Kerry, he and 2 other officers were accused of sexually assaulting the daughters of Dr. Randall McCarthy in Kenmare in June of 1923. Now, Dr. McCarthy was a Free State supporter. I think this only came to light because of his political connections and because he and his daughters were wealthy, were educated. If they had been Republican supporters from the back and beyond who didn't have money and education, would events like that have come to light at all. But the women, apparently, again, these things were reported as incidents and outrages. They wouldn't discuss rape in the papers. The women were flogged and smeared with axle grease by O'Daly and 2 other Free State officers. O'Daly and other officers were never formally convicted of this, but that ended their army careers pretty much. Now, to put all this in context, and I want to be very, because this is so controversial, very clear, I am not saying that rape was used commonly as a weapon of war by either the British Army or the Free State Army or the Republican Army. What I am saying is that incidents like this did happen. They were exceptional, but they did happen. It's worth saying as well that the Hazel Points, the Miss Biggs, and the rape she suffered, it was the only one reported to the British Compensation Claims Commission, so these things were unusual. Go back, look at Dunmanway and the killing of the loyalists, Protestant loyalists there. The Church of Ireland Synod actually says that that's a unique event. This is not happening all over the south. I think there's a comparable event which happens in Auchnavay on the border as well, but we don't have time to go into that. Going back to the struggle between the 2 branches, pro and anti-treaty, this is Brigadier General George Adamson, Free State Army, killed by the IRA in Athlone, April 1922. The Civil War hasn't started yet, people are being killed. As I said, these different forces posturing against each other, and it does spill over into killing occasionally. Famous shot, we've all seen it, of the IRA coming down Grafton Street. Situation in Dublin by April 1922. The barracks have been handed over to the Free State. Large buildings like the Four Courts being taken over by the IRA. Different sections of the IRA. There was all sorts of internal politics, but we won't go into that. Fighting does break out between the IRA and the Free State Army in Kilkenny during the first week of May. Again, we're over a month away from the War of Independence and fighting, or from the Civil War starting, and fighting was broken out. This was stopped. A truce committee or a peace committee was formed. 10 Free State, or 10 officers, 5 Free State, 5 Republican Army. You can see members of them here identified, came together, tried to stop the slide into Civil War. You see here the soldiers again, you can see the obvious demarcation. Free State soldiers outside in their new uniforms, Republicans inside, been fighting with each other a few hours earlier. Peace agreement reached in Kilkenny, shaking hands here for the cameras. What finally triggers the Civil War is not events in Ireland, it's an event in London. Civil War at this stage was pretty much inevitable. The possibility, the IRA, with Collins' support, some branches of them did have a plan to invade the north. That could have changed things completely, but that didn't happen. This is Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson. Returning from Liverpool Street, or going inside, you can see him reading his speech there, going into Liverpool Street Station in London to unveil a memorial to British soldiers killed in the First World War. And on his way home that evening, he is assassinated, or killed, or shot, murdered, whatever you want to call it, by two members of the IRA. Huge debate about whether Collins had ordered it, whether whoever had ordered it, but he's shot at his home. Incidentally, this is the spot. The last time I was in London doing research, I went and spent several hours finding the exact spot where he was shot. Everyone says he was shot in Eaton Square. He wasn't. He was shot down the corner in Eaton Place. But what do you notice? And you can see from the photos the exact same point. What do you notice about the building and where those people are standing is the exact spot where Wilson was killed? There's no plaque. There's no statue. A British field marshal is killed. The guy is buried beside Admiral Nelson under St. Paul's Cathedral, and he doesn't even get a brass plaque. Not at the place he was shot, anyway.
There is one in Liverpool.
There is one in Liverpool Street Station. I've been there, I've seen it, but you would think the point where he was assassinated would be marked. And I've seen his tomb in St. Paul's, and I've seen it says on his inscription, murdered, but not at the spot he was shot. Which raises the question as well, what are events in Britain going to be like during the decade of centenaries? But to finish up anyway, the IRA are still occupying the forecourts. Initially, the British government seems to think that the IRA have ordered Wilson's assassination. They have plans at one stage themselves to actually go and take the IRA out of the forecourts, but they put pressure on Collins to do it. Michael Collins and the Free State Army don't want to be seen to be acting on British orders, so they get lucky when Ginger O'Connell, a Free State officer, is captured and taken prisoner inside the forecourts, and then this gives the excuse that the Free State need to go in. The British had offered, by the way, British RAF planes painted with a tricolour, like you can see here, to bomb the forecourts. This one was put into use later in the Civil War. The Free State government turned that offer down. However, the job was done with British borrowed artillery. That is the fighting you can see at the beginning of the Civil War, which John Dorney is going to cover in the next lecture. But I just want to talk very briefly one or two things about how bitter that became. It's a photograph of a group of 1916 veterans from Marylebone Lane Garrison. What do you notice about the back row?
Airbrush.
Two of them are missing. Haven't been airbrushed, but they've been painted out of it. When we talk about airbrushing, we think of Russia, okay, in later period. This is a picture of Lenin and Trotsky. This was taken, if you believe Enda Kenny's speechwriter, on their trip to West Cork to meet Michael Collins. But watch the next photo. Trotsky disappears, falls out of favour, he's taken out of it. This happens in photos of the War of Independence periods to reflect Civil War politics. Now, I'm not sure if this is the reason why this man is taken out. I suspect it might be. This is Dr. Ryan of Capper White, painted out. Okay. The Civil War. This is the wedding photograph of Kevin O'Higgins. Okay. His best man is Rory O'Connor. What's De Valera doing? He's photobombing it, basically. De Valera had a habit of turning up at weddings like Tom Barry's wedding and actually sat in between the bride and the groom in the wedding photograph, which seems a bit odd to me. A very effective one, I'd imagine. Yeah, well, I won't go further on that line. Going back to more serious matter, this wedding happens during the truce period, and O'Higgins' best man is Rory O'Connor. O'Connor was later one of the 77 executed by the Free State Army during the Civil War. And O'Higgins, this comes up in a debate, in a political debate, and he's accused of all sorts of malice and everything, and he says, malice, vindictiveness, good heavens, one of these men is a friend of mine. And that takes me on to the finishing quote, I'm just one or two slides after this, from Frank Aiken, who began, I think, the Civil War neutral and ended up coming in on the Republican side. He said, war with the foreigner brings to the fore all that is best and noblest in a nation. Civil war, all that is mean and base. A lot of the history I've talked about here and a lot of the photographs I've used come from my last book, Revolution. I have copies here, available in all good bookshops or online from mercyorpress.ie. And I do have a website myself, warofindependence.info. So I've talked long enough, I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much for listening.
Okay, so again, I'd like to thank Pádraig for a typically provocative and opinionated talk, you won't mind me saying. One thing that Pádraig has highlighted here, which is important to remember when we talk about all of this stuff, I think, is how ugly many of the details of the independence struggle actually are. So real people were killed, real people lost their lives. But just to recap before we start questions, Pádraig has argued that the War of Independence escalated right up to the end, that it was still escalating in terms of violence when it finished, that at the end the truce was brought about by a political crisis in the British. Military means were available to have a war of extermination, as Macready himself said, but the political means were not there. The political will was not there to do it. From the IRA's point of view, Pádraig has argued that while areas of the IRA were weak, other areas were growing stronger. So it's not a military decision to truce, it's a political crisis. Pádraig has argued that the split in the Republican movement over the treaty was highly personal. He's illustrated that very well, I think, with the airbrush pictures. I don't think it could be more personal than denying someone's existence after the fact because of the political split. Pádraig has talked about the chaos of early 1922 when there was three rival armies in the country: British Army, the anti-treaty IRA, and the pro-treaty IRA becoming what they termed the National Army or the Free State Army. And in this chaos, Pádraig has talked about various controversial questions. Sectarian question, the killings in Dalmanway in April 1922, when 13 Protestants were killed in circumstances that are still being argued about today. Pádraig has also again brought up the question of sexual assault and rape, which did happen during the truce. And I think while this is not widespread, as Pádraig has argued, it's a very worthwhile thing to bring up, because again, what happens to civilians when there is no civil authority, when military people or people with arms are the masters of a country? I think we have an example of this in Ireland in early 1922, regardless of politics. And sexual assault can be one of the results of this. And finally, Pádraig has argued that the Civil War was possibly inevitable, given that there were two rival armies in the country, but that it was triggered by the assassination in London of Henry Wilson, Field Marshal Wilson, whose death the British Army ordered Collins, on whose death the British government, ordered Michael Collins to act against the anti-treaty side. So after that summation, I'd like to open the floor to questions. I'm sure there are lots of questions. Pádraig has raised many provocative points. I'll start off, Pádraig, with just on the killings of the War of Independence and the informers. The Protestants' share in Cork, this is a very controversial question, was 30%. Is this not out of line with their share of the population in County Cork?
I'll be honest with you, I don't know, and I caution there are suspected spies. There's no piece of evidence 100% which is going to tell you whether these people were actually informers or not. And you can get some good stuff from British records and compensation claims where there's a guy shot by the IRA and the British accept liability for his killing. And you go, God, why is that happening? And you go through the British records and you try to find it, but his file isn't there. For some reason, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but people do talk about files and archives when you read it. I don't know the demographics of Cork that intimately. I am not ruling out entirely the possibility that someone could have used sectarianism to kill people that they had a prejudice against. You'll find bigots everywhere. You could have had people using it to settle old scores, all sorts of stuff. But the idea that's put out there at the moment that there's huge sectarianism, I have difficulties with. And in particular, I have a problem with anonymous victims. I think one thing for the War of Independence, no anonymous quotes from anonymous people and no anonymous victims. I don't want to be reading that 20 people were killed and buried in a bog. Okay, name them. You know, you look at IRA ambushes, and I talked about the Barretts in the War of Independence, and the Barretts would say they killed 16 people in the Monreale ambush in Clare. I have the British records. Not a single British soldier or RIC man was killed in that ambush. So the numbers there, 30% killed. It is higher, but then again, weren't the Protestants loyalist population in Cork very strongly linked with the British military? If you look at Barry Keane's research on the number of Protestants dropping in West Cork after independence, a huge amount of them were actually linked with the British military. Protestants under the penal laws and other times, and particularly Anglicans, Presbyterians had been treated as well, were they had been treated quite favourably by the British government. They had been the established church. Why wouldn't they have had a loyalty to British authority in later years? Same reason why wouldn't an ex-soldier have had a loyalty? It's completely natural.
Or if you could disaggregate the figures, the population percentage Protestant Catholic for the north of Ireland, what does it come out? You mentioned the figure of 25%. I presume that's the country as a whole.
That's the country as a whole.
If you disaggregate that, it may just suggest that the number of Protestants killed were higher than the number of Catholics in percentage terms within the 26 county area.
I haven't done that yet. It may prove that all right. The thing is that when you get percentages of Protestant population, time is generally given for Ireland as a whole rather than for a 26 county area. And even if we took the 26 counties, as I mentioned, there's a lot of counties like Mayo where there's no spy shot at all. So again, further work needs to be done in this area. But all I'm saying is it's not that clear cut.
It would be interesting to get.
It would be. Yes, I haven't done that yet.
Just one thing on that. I come from, maybe it's Ireland's Crimea, West Cork.
Right.
And unfortunately I don't have figures, but I do know that there's probably higher level of Protestant population, the walls, certain walls, and there still is, than other parts of the south of Ireland.
As I said, like Bandon used to be known as the Little Derry or South,
Or even pigs were
or Protestant, going back to the famous penal decree over alleged decree. You don't know is it actually true. But the other thing I should say about my figures there is my research is going up to the 11th of July 1921. Those figures do not include Dunmanway and other things. And I'm open to the argument that sectarianism wasn't really as dominant in the War of Independence, but got worse as the anarchy in the Civil War progressed.
Is the gentleman down the back there?
Yeah, I don't know where to start actually.
Okay.
You know, I'm old-fashioned enough to believe that history, I is always the point. There's always some argument behind it. Look, let me take up a few things.
Sure.
This stuff about the British Army and the atrocities committed and the atrocities the IRA committed. Armies, wars, that's what happens. I'm not justifying it. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but that's what happens. But are you suggesting that somehow or other that the British were less respectable than the Irish, than the IRA, that the IRA were more humane or more decent and more gentlemanly than the British? I don't think that stands up, because wars generally, execution of prisoners, not supposed to happen, does happen.
And I agree with you, both sides, as I said, neither of them is a big
Good.
or committing killings. What I'm saying is, I think in the history that has been presented to us, there is an inordinate focus on Republican killings, but not on British.
Okay, well that's a line, you see, that's a particular line, yeah. But we don't want the other line either. I have my own line, of course.
No, I mean, I did talk about, let's say if we take the very controversial issue of rape, I talked about rapes by British forces, by alleged Republicans, and it seems to have been Republicans, or people call themselves that, and by Free State troops. So I think I'm being as balanced as I can despite my own.
Well, let me just pick up another thing. This is about Connolly and the other chap, Tom Barry, being ex-British Army, that's true. And you said then that there was no real animus against ex-British soldiers and all the rest. But they were British soldiers before the Rising. They were British soldiers before, and in fact they finished being British soldiers, I'm sure, by the Rising. Connolly did certainly, and I'm sure Barry did as well.
Barry was in Iraq at the time fighting for.
And also you have a table there, the table you put up about how many Protestants or the percentage of Protestants killed. Actually, a lot of them seem to be not Protestant, but British soldiers.
Yeah.
You know, so that actually, in a way, undermines your sort of, your figures are very good, your research is very good, but there's a little bit of contradiction there, I think. And I haven't quite finished, I'm going to finish soon. Yeah.
There's other people waiting to get in.
I know.
It's one more point, please.
It's quite important.
One more point, please.
It's quite important because it's about the history of the country and it's about what people do here. You know.
Sure,
Really,
but one more point, please.
Yeah. So look, your man's quote, Aidan, it's in his. If you just put it back up,
Yeah,
you know, it's a terrible quote. Really. War is with the foreigner. It's typically fascist, actually. Typically fascist. And finally, we forgot to mention that the treaty, the treaty was accepted by the majority of people here. Look, there was a civil war. There was a civil war in Finland.
Okay.
At the same time,
Before we go to Finland, if I can address your other points, okay? Regarding ex-soldiers being shot, yeah, I think it's 48% of those suspected spies, civilians killed are British, ex-British soldiers. An equal number were not. The point I would make about that is unemployment was huge for ex-British soldiers at the time. Ex-British soldiers seem to have been particularly hard up. If you would serve in the British Army and you've been trained in a certain way, it would encourage you to be loyal to that army later if a war happens. The British Army recruited Irish ex-British soldiers into them during the War of Independence. Now, I'm sure they didn't just use them for barrack fatigue duties. As for IRA and ex-British soldiers, the IRA were willing to accept British soldiers who had defected. Reginald Hathaway, Walter Stellings, Charlie Chigley in the Midlands, Peter Monaghan in Cork. And I think it wasn't whether someone was an ex-British soldier or not. It was whether they displayed a loyalty to British forces or not. And the other point about the Civil War and people had voted for it, did they vote for it at the point of the gun? When Lloyd George, I'll let you speak, no, let me speak please. Did Lloyd George say, you can take this envelope which has the treaty, or this is immediate and terrible war? The other thing is, and we often forget about this during the decade of centenaries, the position of women. Women did not have a full vote during the vote on the treaty, and it wasn't a plebiscite, it was voting for candidates one way or the other. And it's interesting that all the women in the Dáil ended up going anti-treaty. And the other thing is, a lot of the young men who've been fighting in the war weren't registered to vote, because they weren't going to do that in the middle of the war when turning up to officialdom could get them shot. So look, regarding having points, I think the overall point I'm trying to make is that things are not black and white. There are a lot of grey areas here. Sure. And I have a problem with history when it is presented as black and white. I'm trying to explore the grey.
Okay, I'll just say, just the order of questions there. Sorry, so I'm going to go this lady at the back, then this gentleman at the front, and then yourself, okay? So yeah, go ahead.
I just want to mention, there was a man in Bantry, County Cork, I think it was Mr. Biggs, and his family were burned out. I have the clipping from the Irish Times, and he had to move his family away, his place was burned out. He was a Bradley burner, he was very decent.
He was burned out by?
By Black and Tans.
By the Black and Tans.
So I was just saying it wasn't out of one way. I just want to say to this gentleman, the Republican courts are always forgotten. You know, people are always saying, oh, there was chaos, there was nowhere to go. But the Republican courts
The Republican courts were being wound up and weren't, and in fact there was still competition between the RIC and the Republican courts. They were still shutting them down in early 22. They did, but the problem was that there were competing authorities, and there was chaos because no courts, neither the Republican nor the British.
I don't agree with that. That's just
okay, so
Maxwell, was he the man that was shot the time the Civil War broke out?
Wilson.
That was John and Collins' article.
It's still, we don't have the piece of paper proving that. Okay? So again, grey areas.
Talking about the media at the time was purely propaganda. Just completely brokerage.
I'm actually talking more about the media now reporting propaganda.
I understand, yeah. When you're the media at the time, if you're to look for that, it was a lot of propaganda. So that makes it more difficult.
Yeah, I just want to reply a little bit on that point there. If you look at what was actually happening on the ground in 1922, there are a number of problems. Number one, the British authority is not really working anymore, but parts of it are still trying to work. For example, in the border region, which I've been looking at, the RIC is still trying to close down the Republican courts in early 1922. At the same time, the British Army is being evacuated from the town centres. So who's actually in charge? Whose law is the law? Nobody really knows. And against this background, you have crime, a lot of crime, which all sides complain about. You have a war basically on the border and between the IRA and the Ulster Specials. You have the vestiges of violence from the War of Independence. So they're really, certainly not an anti-Republican state, but there is actually chaos on the ground.
The other thing, John, is if you have a Sinn Féin court, is it pro-treaty or anti-treaty?
Again.
It's largely chaotic. We'll go to the next question.
I just want to make a point because it's always very interesting to discuss the morality of outrages. But if any of you have seen the famous documentary on Robert McNamara, The Fall of War, in it he's asked about the Vietnam War. And he said there is no morality in war. Once war starts, there's only one purpose, and that is to win it.
Indeed.
And morality is forgotten.
Okay, well, there's a famous quote from an American general who says the point of war is not to die for a country, it's to make the other war someone they die for his. And I think that's the point I'm making. That the point I'm making is that when you read history books and read, quite a lot of the time you get, the IRA fighting uniforms that are not a proper army and the rules of war don't apply. But I'm making the point the British didn't either, and I think I agree with you in a lot of ways when it comes to revenge killings, when it comes to the rules of war weren't obeyed by either side. I think I said that in the lecture, because a lot of the time they just didn't feel the effect.
Okay, again, the order of questions. I'm going to go to the Minister first, and then we'll go to yourself, and then yourself, okay?
Getting back to the question, you gave more detail than even was given John Bogdanova's lecture about the Khmer incident, and you mentioned that was not an act of war. And ostensibly it wasn't, because, of course, the women raped weren't Republicans. But I think it's more complex than that. I actually think it was an act of war, because there was an act of revenge in the context of Niall Harrington, a Free State officer, exposing Paddy O'Daly for the Ballyseedy incident and bringing complaints up to Dublin. Niall Harrington was the boyfriend of one of those girls, and when they were raped, O'Daly actually accused Harrington and a friend of Harrington's as having been the rapist, and that was discounted. So it seems to be an act of sheer vengeance on the part of O'Daly, indirectly getting Harrington for daring to expose him.
To make the point, it was Free State on Free State supporters. Yeah. And the other thing is what I said there about rape not being a weapon of war. What I'm saying is this is not the Red Army going into Germany in World War II. This is not the Balkans. I'm saying these kind of incidents happen. But you couldn't say that the Free State Army was using rape.
No, it's contrary. It was so unusual, because otherwise I think you would have seen a pattern of O'Daly and his cohorts having done it to Republicans.
And again, there is a lot more to this, obviously, Manus, than I just skimmed across the top of it. There's IRB politics and everything, but I agree with most of what you're saying.
You didn't mention that could have resonance with what's happening today in Ukraine, and where the West is defending the human rights of the people. So it's wrong for the Russian soldiers to be on Ukraine. But it's all right for British soldiers to be on aggression. We're the only occupied country in Europe.
But what I'd say on that is, I'm a historian, not a modern politician. The reason why I mentioned Ukraine was just what I wanted to get a modern analogy for what we were seeing in the past, something that could bring it to your mind easily. So I'm talking about the chaotic scramble in Ukraine at the moment for barracks and position and political prowess. That's what it was like as the British withdrew. I'm not directly comparing Ireland to Ukraine, and that region has a long history which I'm not expert on. No. And we won't go into modern politics.
The beauty makes it black and white.
And life is great.
Okay, yeah, really quick, yes, sir.
Yeah. You made an intriguing reference to the Sligo priest, Father Flanagan, his position. In view of the fact that he was an important person in the first hour, for example, you said the opening prayers. What was it that you were going to say, but you didn't finish?
Oh, sorry. O'Flanagan was involved in early truce negotiations in December of September, October, November of 1920. He basically seems to have sent a telegram to the British government with all sorts of political developments in Galway, but basically on his own that he sent a unilateral telegram to the British government saying Ireland is ready for peace, what first move do you suggest? Now, the thing is, he didn't have authority, he didn't speak for the IRA firstly, he spoke for the kind of political class in Sinn Féin. He didn't have authority to do this from De Valera, Collins, Griffith. It was a solo run, and the other thing is he had a slightly different policy. His argument was on the north, that the Unionists, the Loyalists were there, who couldn't change their mind. He would have been happy with a republic, and I think he was on the record that for pretty much the 26 counties. And that's the point I was making about him and his involvement in negotiating the truce, or attempting to.
Do you have any breakdown of the number of volunteers or Protestants and Irish volunteers in IRA?
No, but I can tell you there is someone doing a PhD in it in Trinity College at the moment. I can tell you they're not as rare as they think. As you think, for example, in Limerick City, you have Otto Hasselbeck, and he's from a German Protestant family. A lot of Palatine's German Protestants came over. You have people like Frank Bustede, who are mixed marriage, who I think declared himself an atheist in later life. You have people like the Gray family, who were from mixed marriage, were brought up and educated Presbyterian, and in later life were Presbyterian, but for some reason are now in the census as Catholics. The Citizen Army, and they were active in Dublin during the War of Independence, have Protestants in it as well. I think Conor Morrissey is the guy in Trinity College who was writing on that. If you look at County Clare, for example, I'm not aware of any Protestants fighting in the flying column in County Clare, but I can tell you that the Mid-Clare Brigade's doctor was Stuart, and he was an Ulster Protestant. I can tell you, if you look at Erskine Childers, Robert Barton, and they are more Sinn Féin, but nominally involved with the IRA, they're Protestants as well.
Okay, we're nearly out of time, so what I'm going to ask is, anyone who still wants to ask a question, put your hand in the air. We'll ask them all, and Corey can respond to them. Anyone else? 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'll take 3 more questions. Quick as you can, please.
Okay. Quickly, as far as Secretary is concerned, you made a very good point. But my impression is that the sectarian component of the attacks IRA attacks became more notable after the beginning of the pogroms in the north. But I would say that may have stimulated them. Had they stimulated them in sort of to a greater degree as the struggle itself got hotter, it would be interesting to know. The second thing is politically, I think you don't mention the non-election to the second Dáil in 1921, when there wasn't a single seat contested, and Sinn Féin swept the board except for Trinity, of course. But that undoubtedly, I suggest, made considerable pressure on the British opinion.
Okay, two points there. Just hold that thought for a second before you get.
Just regarding one of the points you made about the fact that a lot of the sectarian or the attacks by Crown forces, atrocities by Crown forces during the War of Independence were carried out by Irish Catholics on Irish Catholics. I mean, given the fact that thousands of Irish Catholics were in the police force, which before the breakout of the war was a perfectly acceptable police force to most Irish people. And they were basically, from what I've been driven crazy by the fact there was a massive assassination campaign against them by the IRA. It started off that if it wasn't justifiable, but certainly understandable, that they reacted or overreacted.
Okay, great. Yeah, hold that thought for a second. Again, one more question, and then we'll try to answer all 3 together. Possible.
Yes, you mentioned there were 3 armies. I'm just curious, would UVF being regarded as a forward army?
The Ulster Specials are 4-time.
Very quickly, this is like history speed dating. The UVF essentially have become the Special Constabulary, pretty much lock, stock and barrel, and I would include them as part of the British forces. Regarding Irishmen in the RIC, yes, huge amount of Irishmen in the RIC. I would say that the force of reputation was mixed. If you look at things like, and I know it was mainly the DLP, but the RIC were also involved in the lockout. But the point I made there was, look, not all the black and tans were English, not all the Irish black and tans were Orange, Northern, Loyalist, Protestants. I'm again stressing that history is a grey area, and why wouldn't you have found Irishmen in the RIC? It was a very good job. But there's a great book by Thomas Fennell on the RIC, and he argues that, look, I was an RIC constable. It was a job for us at the time. We didn't realise when we got into it that the whole point of the force seemed to be to back up landlordism and to back up British rule. But again, the RIC, very interesting force, but again, let's take the black and white out of it, huge areas of grey there. I think I did mention the 1921 election, but I did say that I was focusing mainly on military stuff. And the first question you asked me?
About the question of the
sectarianism possibly getting worse because of what was happening in Belfast. It could be because of what was happening in Belfast. It could also be that things were just getting more chaotic at that time and it was coincidental. But again, the whole point is, ask questions, read history. Don't just sail through the decade of commemorations, waving flags and laying wreaths. Things like this, things like the History Ireland hedge schools, debates, discussion. That's what we need. We need to come out with it knowing more than we went into. And the last thing, if I can remind you before we go, we're done. I'm flogging books.